Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Battle of Los Angeles. Chapter 1. The City That Feared the Dark. Imagine 2 million people, all of them asleep. It is the small hours before sunrise on the morning of February 25th, 1942. Los Angeles is quiet in the way that only a wartime city can be quiet, not peacefully, not naturally, but with the held-breath stillness of a place that has been told to expect the worst and has been obediently, exhaustingly waiting for it. The orange groves are dark. The film studios are dark. The oil refineries and the shipyards, the boulevard restaurants, and the neighborhood churches, and the modest bungalows and the Spanish colonial mansions climbing into the hills. All of it dark, tucked into the California night, breathing in and out under a sky that in the hours before what comes next is lit only by stars and a moon 3 days past full. This is a city that has, in the 10 weeks since Pearl Harbor, been transformed almost beyond recognition. Beach access along much of the Southern California coastline has been restricted. Barbed wire has appeared on the sand at Santa Monica and Venice. Camouflage netting has been draped over the Douglas Aircraft Factory in Long Beach, disguising its rooftop as a residential neighborhood from the air, an exercise in theatrical concealment that its designers hoped would confuse Japanese bombers, and that mostly confused the workers on the ground. Military personnel are stationed at Hollywood studios. The glamour of the entertainment capital has been interrupted without fanfare by the logistics of a war it did not ask for and cannot quite believe is happening. Then the sirens came. In the space of minutes, those 2 million people come awake all at once, hauled out of their dreams by a sound that no one ever quite gets used to, no matter how many times they drill for it. Air raid sirens, the sound designed deliberately to be impossible to ignore, low at first, then climbing in pitch, wailing up through the quiet streets and over the rooftops and through the closed windows of every house and apartment and hotel room for miles and miles in every direction. People in pajamas and bathrobes stumble to their windows. Air raid wardens sprint into the streets blowing their whistles, ordering lights off, ordering people indoors. The city drops into darkness so total, it feels alive. And then, a few minutes after 3 in the morning, the guns begin. The anti-aircraft batteries positioned on rooftops, on hilltops, at the edges of the city where the Los Angeles basin opens towards the Pacific, begin to fire, not 1 or 2 guns, but dozens. The muzzle flashes light up the rooftops, tracer rounds glowing orange and white, shriek upward in long arcs, 12.8-pound shells detonated in the sky in clouds of black smoke and white fire. Searchlights, enormous ones, powerful enough to be seen for miles, lance upward and sweep back and forth, their beams crossing and crisscrossing, creating what one witness would later describe as a wigwam of light built from pure, electricity. Shell bursts bloom in the dark like brief white flowers. The sound of it is unlike anything most of these people have ever heard. A continuous, overlapping thunder, intimate and enormous at the same time, shaking windows in their frames, reverberating off the hills, rolling out across the basin towards the sea. People watching from their rooftops, in back porches, in fire escapes, will later say it was the most spectacular thing they had ever seen. A few say it was beautiful. Many say it was terrifying. A handful of people caught in darkened cars on blacked out streets or stricken by the shock of it will not survive the morning. When daylight comes and guns fall silent, search parties fan out across the city and its surrounding hills, looking for wreckage, looking for bodies, looking for craters in the earth and the debris of aircraft brought down. They find nothing. No enemy planes, no bombs, no casualties attributable to any enemy action. The only damage is from the shells the American guns fired themselves, shrapnel raining down on houses, cars, streets. An unexploded dud in a Long Beach golf course, broken windows in the hills, a handful of partially collapsed structures where 3-inch shells came through rooftops. The Navy will say the whole thing was a false alarm. The Army will say 15 planes definitely flew over the city. The Secretary of War will suggest those planes might have been commercial aircraft operated by enemy agents from secret airstrips in Mexico. The Secretary of the Navy will call that a fantasy. A congressman from Santa Monica will demand a full investigation and describe the episode as complete mystification. The Japanese government, when asked about it after the war, will say with puzzled formality that it never flew any aircraft over Los Angeles during the entire conflict. Nobody could agree on what happened. Not the Army, not the Navy, not the congressmen, not the reporters, and not the 2 million people who had spent the night listening to the guns. The barrage expended over 1,400 rounds into the dark California sky, and no one, including the men who fired it, could say with certainty what they had been firing at. And that question, what was up there, has never, in the 80-plus years since that night, been definitively answered. It is one of the most thoroughly documented, most widely witnessed, and most genuinely puzzling events in American military history. And because of the date, because of the place, because of the photograph published in the next morning in the Los Angeles Times, a photograph that appears to show searchlights converging on something solid, something disc-shaped, something that looks for all the world like the flying saucers that won't be named for another 5 years. The Battle of Los Angeles has grown into something far larger than the wartime misunderstanding. It is also, importantly, a story that sits at the hinge point between two eras, the America of December 1941 and the America of December 1945, are almost unrecognizable as the same country, not just in terms of military power, but in terms of psychology, self-conception, and relationship with institutions of authority. The Battle of Los Angeles belongs to the earliest, most disoriented days of the war, when the country was still reacting rather than acting, when fear was running ahead of capability, when the military and the government or in the process of building systems and cultures that would not be fully functional for months or years. It is a document of that fragile, dangerous transition period and its peculiarities, the confusion, the contradictions, the phantom enemy, are the peculiarities of that specific historical moment. It has become, depending on who you ask, a case study in mass hysteria, a cover-up of something genuinely unknown, a landmark moment in the prehistory of the UFO era, and the single most dramatic night in the wartime history of the American home front. Understanding what happened on that February morning requires starting much earlier, with the world Los Angeles inhabited in early 1942, because the battle, whatever it was, did not come out of nowhere. It was born from fear that was deep, reasonable, and historically grounded, and the two cannot be separated from each other. Chapter 2: The World on Fire. There is a tendency looking back at the Second World War from our current vantage point to see it as something the outcome of which was always somewhat inevitable. The Allied powers, enormous in industrial and righteous, grinding down the Axis to surrender. That hindsight tends to flatten the texture of what living through that war actually felt like, especially in its early stages, especially for ordinary Americans who had never thought they would be in it. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, was not just a military blow. It was a psychological rupture. Before Pearl Harbor, the war in Europe and Asia was something that happened elsewhere, catastrophically, horrifyingly, but elsewhere. Americans read about it in newspapers and heard about it in the radio programs they listened to in the evenings. But it belonged to other countries, other peoples. The America First movement, a significant and influential isolationist coalition, had argued for keeping the country out of the conflict, and millions of Americans had agreed with them, had wanted the security of ocean distance between themselves and the carnage. Pearl Harbor dissolved all of that in a single Sunday morning, and the country found itself at war before it had finished listening to the radio broadcast that announced it. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a coordinated surprise attack against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, sinking or damaging 21 ships, destroying nearly 200 aircraft, and killing 2,403 Americans. It remains one of the most stunning single-day military blows in American history. And its effect on the national psyche was immediate and total. Within days, Congress had declared war on Japan, and Germany and Italy had responded by declaring war on the United States, drawing America into the full global catastrophe of the Second World War. But here's the thing that is important to understand if you want to understand the Battle of Los Angeles. In December 1941 and January and February of 1942, the war was going catastrophically bad, not just for the United States, for all the Allied powers. Germany had conquered most of continental Europe and was deep into the Soviet Union. Japan was moving with startling speed throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Wake Island fell to Japan on December 23rd. The British fortress of Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. By January, Japanese forces were advancing through Malaya, threatening Singapore, which Churchill famously called the key to the defense of Australia and India, and which would fall catastrophically and humiliatingly on February 1942. The Philippines were under invasion. American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur were falling back onto the Bataan Peninsula, beginning the siege that would end in the largest American military surrender in history. The Japanese military in early 1942 seemed to those watching it almost supernatural in its capability, though, in fact, it was well-trained, well-equipped, and well-led, prosecuting a strategic offensive it had planned for years with the advantages of surprise and momentum. To ordinary Americans who had not yet had time to understand Japan's real strengths and real limitations, what was happening across the Pacific felt like the advance of an unstoppable force. It is worth dwelling a moment on the Japanese military machine, as it existed and as it was perceived in early 1942, because the gap between reality and perception matters enormously for understanding what happened in Los Angeles. Japan's armed forces in 1941 and early 1942 were genuinely formidable, the result of decades of modern military development, a rigorous training culture, and strategic planning that had been underway for years before the first shot was fired. The aircraft that attacked Pearl Harbor were world-class. The Mitsubishi Zero, the primary Japanese carrier fighter, was faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans had in service in 1941. Japanese naval aviators were among the most experienced in the world, many of them combat-hardened in the ongoing war with China. Japanese submarines were large, long-range, and numerous. But the perception of Japan's capabilities on the American home front was in significant ways even larger than the reality. Americans in early 1942 did not yet know the full extent of Japanese military weaknesses, the supply chain vulnerabilities, the strategic overextension, the shortage of experienced pilots that Japan was beginning to develop, even as its initial offensive ran roughshod over Allied defenses. What Americans saw was an unbroken string of victories across a vast geography, achieved with apparent ease and speed. The American psyche had not yet had time to calibrate its fear to the actual dimensions of the threat. On the west coast of the United States, this produced a specific, geographically grounded terror. California was the closest part of the continental United States to Japan. The Pacific Ocean was not, it turns out, an impenetrable buffer. Pearl Harbor had made that clear. The question that haunted California in the winter of 1942 was not abstract. It was immediate and personal. Could Japan attack the mainland? Could Japanese aircraft reach California? Could Japanese submarines shell the shore? Could Japanese troops somehow land on the beach? Military planners took these questions seriously. The West Coast was not militarily insignificant. It contained major naval shipyards in San Diego, Bremerton, and Puget Sound. Aircraft manufacturing plants spread from Los Angeles to Seattle, oil refineries, rail infrastructure, ports. The Army began installing anti-aircraft batteries. Civil defense was organized. Air raid wardens were appointed and drilled. Blackout procedures were developed and practiced. Children in California schools were told what to do in case of bombing. The psychological preparation was meticulous, thorough, and perhaps unavoidably anxiety-inducing. And anxiety was also being generated by events that were not hypothetical at all. Beginning almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines, the long-range Type 1 class boats, capable of operating across vast stretches of the Pacific, began attacking shipping off the American West Coast. In the weeks between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Los Angeles, more than a dozen American merchant vessels were attacked in waters just off California, Oregon, and Washington. The SS Cynthia Olsen was sunk. The SS Montebello was sunk. The SS Larry Doheny was sunk. The SS Emidio was damaged. The SS Absaroka was damaged. Ships were going down within sight of shore, within sight of cities. The war, which Americans had hoped to experience from behind the safety of an ocean, was already outside their window. In Juneau, Alaska, residents were ordered to cover their windows at night because Japanese submarines were believed to be lurking off the southeastern Alaskan coast. In Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco, rumors of an enemy carrier cruising offshore caused the city to close its schools and order a blackout. Police cars with civil defense sirens drove through the streets, and radio silence was ordered. The carrier was imaginary, but the fear was entirely rational, given what was actually happening in the waters off the coast. This is the atmosphere, thick with real threat, amplified by imagination, held at a constant low boil by the news from the Pacific, into which a Japanese submarine commander fired a handful of shells at a California oil field on the evening of February 23, 1942. And it is only against this backdrop that what happened 2 days later makes any sense at all. Chapter 3. The Bombardment of Elwood. Commander Kozu Nishino was a career naval officer who had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1920 and spent his entire professional life in submarines. He commanded the I-17, a Type B-1 submarine, enormous by the standards of any navy at the time, displacing 3,654 long tons when submerged and stretching 365 feet from bow to stern. The I-17 was equipped with 6 torpedo tubes, 17 torpedoes, and a 14-centimeter deck gun, a weapon that, in calm seas with a skilled crew, could fire accurately at targets on shore. She carried 101 officers and men. In early February 1942, Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu, commanding Japan's submarine force from his flagship at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, had assigned several submarines to patrol the waters south of Hawaii in hopes of ambushing American carrier task forces returning from a raid on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. On February 7th, he redirected the I-17, detaching her from the patrol group and ordering her to head for the California coast. Her mission, in essence, was terror, to strike an American target on the mainland and generate fear among the civilian population, to remind the Americans that the war could reach them directly. The target Nishino chose was the Elwood oil field, located near Goleta, a small community about 12 miles northwest of Santa Barbara, along the Gaviota coast. The field had been discovered in 1928 and was operated by the Barnsdale Rio Grande Oil Company. It had extensive above-ground infrastructure, tank, derricks, a pump house, a pier. As a symbol of the California industrial economy, it was well chosen. and it had the virtue, from Nishino's perspective, of being on the coast with relatively easy approach. There is a story, a persistent and romantic story, that Nishino had once visited the Elwood Field before the war as the captain of a merchant oil tanker, and that he had suffered some embarrassment there, slipping on the dock and falling into a cactus, which caused the assembled California oilmen to laugh, and that he chose Elwood for the shelling as a personal act of revenge. It is a wonderful story, but almost certainly not true. Detailed research into Nishino's naval career confirms he spent his entire professional life in submarines and never commanded a merchant vessel. The story spread widely anyway, and has attached itself to the event with the stubborn tenacity that good stories always manage. What is true is that on the evening of February 23, 1942, twilight was settling over the California coast, and most Americans were gathered around their radios, listening to President Franklin Roosevelt deliver one of his famous fireside chats, the first since the declaration of war against Japan 11 weeks earlier. Roosevelt asked his listeners to spread a map of the world before them so they could follow his references to the world encircling battle lines. It was an intimate moment of national address, the president talking directly into millions of Americans' living rooms. At 7:15 in the evening, while Roosevelt was still speaking, Commander Nishino ordered the I-17's deck gun cleared for action. The submarine was sitting approximately 1,000 yards off of California coast. Its crew took aim at the Richfield aviation fuel tank just beyond the beach. The sea was dark and the waves were moderate, making accuracy difficult, but Nishino ordered them to fire anyway. A 10-year-old boy named J.J. Hollister III, listening to the fireside chat at his family's home in Winchester Canyon, was startled by a distant thunder. A moment later, he heard a whistling noise and a thump as something landed near the house. His family scrambled outside and saw bright flashes near the oil field on the shore. The workers on duty at the field that evening, a skeleton crew, most of the day shift had already gone home, initially mistook the sounds for an internal explosion. Then one of them spotted the silhouette of the submarine offshore, and they called the police. The shells came in for about 20 minutes. Nishino fired somewhere between 12 and 26 rounds, estimates vary, targeting the oil tanks, the pier, the pump house. The results were modest. A derrick destroyed, the pump house damaged, the pier and a catwalk suffering minor damage. A single large crater dug by a shell that landed several miles away at a ranch without detonating. Total property damage came to approximately $500, with no injuries and no fire. When car lights appeared on shore and a distant siren began to wail, Nishino ordered his gunners to cease fire and got the I-17 underway, radioing Tokyo to report that he had left Santa Barbara in flames. The claims were wildly exaggerated, as operational reports in wartime so often are, but Nishino had achieved his mission regardless. The physical damage was almost irrelevant. What the shelling accomplished was panic. Across Southern California, news of the shelling spread by word of mouth and radio broadcast within hours, amplified and distorted with each retelling. The sheriff's office in Santa Barbara was flooded with calls. Witnesses claimed to see offshore signal lights. The Reverend Arthur Basham of Montecito called the police to report that he had personally seen the enemy submarine from his home and added helpfully that it had turned south towards Los Angeles, flashing signal lights to someone on shore. It had not. the I-17 had sailed west and was already heading toward open water, but the Reverend's report spread through the community with all the authority of eyewitness testimony. Hundreds of families fled inland from the coast. The mandatory blackouts that followed extended from Goleta south to the outskirts of Los Angeles. Military intelligence was put on high alert. Naval intelligence issued a warning. The California coast should expect further attacks within the next 24 hours. The machinery of defensive readiness, already wound tight, was wound tighter still. It is worth pausing to appreciate what the bombardment of Elwood actually meant in the context of American history. It was, at the time, the first naval bombardment of the continental United States by a foreign power since the War of 1812, when British warships shelled American coastal targets. Specifically, this was the first such attack since the Battle of Baltimore in September 1814, when British ships bombarded Fort McHenry across the harbor and inspired Francis Scott Key to write what would become the American national anthem. That was 128 years earlier. And now, here was an enemy nation shelling California from a submarine while the president was on the radio talking about the world at war. The psychological weight of that cannot be overstated. And Roosevelt, meanwhile, who knew about the Elwood shelling within hours of its occurrence, used it in the days that followed as additional justification for Executive Order 9066, which he had already signed in February 19th, 4 days before the Elwood attack. That executive order authorized the forced relocation and internment of Japanese Americans living in designated military zones, an event that would affect more than 120,000 people, the vast majority of them American citizens, stripped of their homes and businesses and sent to camps in the interior for the duration of the war. Elwood did not cause the internment order. That had already been signed, but it hardened public and political support for it, drowning out the voices of those who had been arguing against such an extreme measure. The connection between these events, the Elwood shelling, the Battle of Los Angeles, and the internment of Japanese Americans, is not coincidental. They were threads in the same fabric of fear, each one tightening the other. Chapter 4. The Night of February 24th. The day of February 24th was tense in Los Angeles in the quiet, grinding way that days are tense when people are waiting for something and do not know exactly what. The Elwood shelling had been on the front pages that morning. Office of Naval Intelligence had issued its warning about attacks expected within 10 hours. The military had been alert since before dawn. Gun crews were at their batteries. Air raid wardens had been briefed again on their procedures. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade, a National Guard unit from the Pacific Northwest that had been stationed in Southern California to protect the city, had its anti-aircraft batteries positioned throughout the Los Angeles basin, their guns loaded and elevated, their crews tense and watchful. It is worth understanding what the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade actually was in human terms, because the people manning the guns that night have sometimes been portrayed as a kind of faceless institutional machinery when they were, in fact, young men in a remarkable and frightening situation. The 37th was a National Guard unit, meaning its members were not career regular Army soldiers, but civilians who had enlisted in their state's Guard force, trained part-time, and been mobilized when the war began. Many of them came from Washington and Oregon, from small towns and farms and cities in the Pacific Northwest. They had been rushed through training on the new anti-aircraft equipment, moved to California after Pearl Harbor, and given the responsibility of protecting the largest city on the West Coast from air attacks. Their average age was probably in the low 20s. Their operational experience in the kind of scenario they were now facing, actual enemy aircraft over an American city at night, was zero, because no such scenario has ever occurred in American history. The situation on the night of February 24th was designed by its circumstances to produce exactly what it produced. Young men, barely trained on new technology they didn't yet fully understand, stationed in a city they had been told was about to be attacked. One day after the enemy had actually shelled the California coast, in the middle of the night, with a report of enemy contact already registered on their radar screens. These were not conditions in which sound, measured judgment was likely to prevail. They were conditions in which the training to fire on contact and the fear of being the person who failed to act would combine predictably and tragically into the barrage that came. The Coast Artillery as a military branch is worth understanding in some depth because it is central to what happens that night. The Coast Artillery's mission was to protect American shorelines and harbors from enemy bombardment, originally conceived in the context of enemy warships approaching and shelling port cities, but adapted in early 20th century to include anti-aircraft defense as aviation became a military reality. By 1942, Coast Artillery batteries were equipped with the 3-inch M1918 anti-aircraft gun. The 12.8-pound shells referenced in the accounts of that night, as well as .5 caliber machine guns for lower altitude targets. These weapons were capable, in principle, of engaging aircraft at altitudes up to roughly 27,000 feet for the 3-inch guns, though accurate fire at high altitude required sophisticated fire control systems. The fire control technology available to American anti-aircraft gunners in early 1942 was a subject of some debate even at the time. American anti-aircraft equipment had improved significantly in the years leading up to the war, incorporating mechanical fire directors, analog computing devices that integrated range, altitude, speed, and bearing to predict the future position of moving target and calculate the correct gun elevation and azimuth. But these systems were only as good as the quality of the data fed into them, and the data on the night of February 24th to 25th was going to be extremely poor. Radar was the other piece of technology that shaped what happened. In 1942, radar was still genuinely new. It had been developed in earnest in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Deployed with sometimes spectacular effectiveness as in the Battle of Britain, but also subject to significant limitations that inexperienced operators were still learning to identify and compensate for. The American radar units deployed in California in early 1942 were among the first to be fielded operationally, and the operators manning them had little practical experience. Radar returns from distant objects were often ambiguous. They could indicate aircraft, but they could also indicate flocks of birds, weather formations, ionospheric anomalies, or equipment malfunction. And the problem was compounded by the fact that in early 1942, American radar could not reliably determine altitude. It could tell you something was out there and approximately how far away, but not how high it was flying. On the evening of February 24th, flares and blinking lights were reported near several defense plants in the Los Angeles area. An alert was issued at 7:18 in the evening, and then, when no attack materialized, lifted again at 10:23 at night. People tried to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, Army radar picked up what appeared to be an unidentified contact approximately 120 miles west of Los Angeles, approaching from the direction of the Pacific. At 2:21 in the morning, the regional controller ordered a blackout across the city. The city went dark immediately, thousands of blackout curtains being drawn, thousands of houses and businesses and streetlights going dark. Air raid wardens were summoned to their posts. Anti-aircraft crews went to battle stations. For a while, nothing seemed to happen. The radar contact, whatever it was, appeared to fade and then disappear before it reached the coast. But the information center, monitoring all incoming reports, was now being flooded with phone calls from observers all over the city. At 2:43 in the morning, planes were reported near Long Beach, south of the city proper. A few minutes later, a Coast Artillery colonel reported seeing approximately 25 planes at 12,000 feet over Los Angeles. At 3:06 in the morning, a balloon carrying a red flare was spotted over Santa Monica. The report described it clearly as a balloon, and 4 batteries of anti-aircraft artillery opened fire. And then, in the words of the Army Air Force's own official history, compiled after the war, quote, "The air over Los Angeles erupted like a volcano." Chapter 5. The Barrage Itself. It began in Santa Monica, where the coast bends and the sea approaches the city most directly, and it spread outward from there like fire through dry grass. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade had more than 250 anti-aircraft guns distributed across the Los Angeles basin, on rooftops, on the grounds of parks and golf courses and defense plants, on hilltops, on the open ground at the edges of the city. When the first battery in Santa Monica opened fire, the neighboring batteries, hearing guns and assuming there must be something to shoot at, followed suit. This is a well-documented psychological and military phenomenon. In conditions of high anxiety and low visibility, when one gun fires, the others tend to follow, each additional burst of fire apparently confirming the presence of a target. The technical term for this is sympathetic firing, and its occurrence on the morning of February 25th is not in serious dispute. The guns of the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade began firing at 3:16 in the morning and would not fall fully silent until 4:14, nearly an hour of continuous overlapping fire. Over the course of that hour, they expended more than 1,412.8-pound anti-aircraft shells and additional quantities of .5 caliber machine gun ammunitions. This is an enormous quantity of ammunition to fire at a single target or group of targets. For context, the guns of the brigade were firing at a rate of roughly 24 shells per minute during the most intense periods of the barrage. Shell fragments from those rounds, the jagged, heavy steel shards produced when an artillery shell detonates, rain down across the city in a radius of many miles. The searchlights were at least as important visually as the guns. Los Angeles had an extensive searchlight network, part of the same coastal defense system. These were carbon arc searchlights, generating beams of extraordinary brightness, some with an output measured in hundreds of millions of candle power, visible for tens of miles. Carbon arc searchlights work by striking an arc between two carbon electrodes in an enclosed lamp housing, generating light that is extraordinarily bright and bluish-white in color, similar in quality to daylight. When these beams swept upward and crossed one another in the smoke-filled sky above a city in total blackout, the effect was by all accounts unlike anything most people had ever seen. The Los Angeles Times would later describe it memorably. Scores of searchlights built a wigwam of light beaming over Los Angeles. Civilians watching from rooftops and back porches and from their yards reported the night turning into something that looked nothing like night, a strange, inverted brightness in the sky above the dark city, interrupted by the pulsing orange flashes of shell bursts, by the streaking white lines of tracer rounds, by the drifting clouds of smoke that the guns were producing in quantity. What did people see in all of that light and chaos? This is where the accounts diverge, in ways that are not just interesting, but genuinely haunting, because the witnesses were real people, many of them experienced and sober-minded, and what they described is fascinating. It is worth letting their words breathe because the witness testimony is one of the most important and most overlooked elements of this event. Summaries do not capture it. The accounts have to be encountered in something close to their original form. Some witnesses reported seeing nothing at all, just the guns firing into empty sky, the searchlights finding only clouds of smoke in their own crossing beams. These were not the minority. Many people who climbed out onto their rooftops or pressed their faces against blacked-out windows reported an extraordinary visual spectacle. The most spectacular thing they had ever seen, several had said. But no aircraft. Only the guns, only the light, only the smoke and the sound. For them, the night was terrifying and beautiful, and completely empty of enemy aircraft. This group of witnesses is easy to discount in retrospect because they reported nothing unusual, but their presence in the historical record is important. It means the accounts of people who did see something specific cannot be explained as simple universal panic. The people who reported nothing were just as frightened as the people who reported formations of planes. But then, there are the other witnesses. A Coast Artillery soldier named Charles Patrick, who was at one of the batteries during the entire barrage, wrote a detailed letter to his family in the days afterward. Patrick was not a civilian stumbling out of bed. He was a trained gunner at a fire position. He had every reason to be scanning the sky carefully. He wrote, "I could barely see the planes, but they were up there all right. I could see 6 planes, and shells were bursting all around them. Naturally, all of us fellows were anxious to get our 2 cents worth in. And when the command came, everybody cheered like a son of a gun." Patrick was clear, firm, and specific. 6 planes, shells bursting around them. He had no doubt about what he saw. Lily Hayden lived in Culver City, a community that sits close to several of the defense plants that were considered priority targets in any Japanese air raid. She was awake during the barrage, watching from outside her home. She told reporters from the Los Angeles Times in an account published February 26th. All of a sudden, there was a tremendous explosion, and a flare shot into the sky. We could see a plane right over our heads. Then there were more explosions and more flares. The noise was terrific. She added that she watched the plane catch fire and saw it appear to descend. She was unequivocal that what was overhead was an aircraft. She described the experience of watching it with the kind of granular, sensory detail. The noise, the flare, the explosion, that is characteristic of genuine eyewitness memory rather than reconstructed narrative. Then, there's the group of witnesses that researchers and investigators have returned to again and again. The people watching through binoculars from elevated positions who described a large, single object, distinctly non-aircraft in character, moving slowly over the city. These accounts share enough specific detail to be striking in aggregate. Multiple independent observers, using optical magnification, describe something they characterize as large, orange, or reddish-orange in color, moving at a steady, unhurried pace from the direction of Santa Monica southward towards Long Beach, a distance of roughly 20 miles, traversed over approximately 30 minutes. That is a speed of about 40 miles per hour, which is very slow for aircraft in 1942, consistent with the balloon drifting on the wind, but also consistent with something else that nobody in 1942 had a name for. An employee of the Los Angeles Herald Express, who was present during the barrage, stated emphatically that he was certain shells had hit whatever was in the sky, directly hit it, and that the object had been completely unaffected. He described seeing bursts erupt right at the location of the object with no visible damage, no debris, no change of course, no apparent effect whatsoever. This account sits uncomfortably with the weather balloon theory because a direct hit from a 12.8-pound anti-aircraft shell would have disintegrated any balloon ever manufactured. If his account is accurate, the balloon explanation fails. Other observers from hilltops in the Hollywood and Griffith Park areas, with unobstructed sight lines across the basin, reported a consistent picture of something slow and large. One described it as globular, not like a plane at all, not like a formation, but a single round shape moving steadily through the searchlight beams, apparently impervious to the fire around it. Several noted that despite the intensity of the barrage and the number of shells detonating in its immediate vicinity, the object never changed direction, never accelerated, and crucially, never disintegrated or fell. An air raid warden working the coastal zone near Santa Monica reported seeing what he described as a kind of dull orange glow that was distinct from the brilliant white-blue of the searchlights and the orange flashes of the gunbursts. The glow moved in a way, he said, was not like anything I had seen flying. He watched it for several minutes before losing it in the smoke. He filed his report with the Civil Defense Post as a matter of routine, and it sat in the records. A military lookout station at one of the shore observation posts reported seeing lights that he described as moving in formation and then converging as if multiple smaller objects were assembling around a central one. He could not account for the pattern by any aircraft behavior he knew. He reported it up the chain of command, as he was supposed to, and the report was absorbed into the flood of incoming data. These accounts create a problem that honest analysts of the event have to grapple with. Not because they prove anything extraordinary, they do not in isolation, but because they form a pattern that the simple weather balloon plus war nerves explanation does not cleanly account for. The witnesses who described a large, slow, orange, apparently invulnerable object were not all frightened civilians stumbling around in the dark. Some of them were trained military observers using instruments. Some of them filed official reports rather than talking to newspapers. Some of them, in recounting their experience decades later, were still specific and consistent in ways that distinguish genuine memory from the gradual distortion of recollection. The Army Air Force's own official history, written by people with access to all of the preliminary reports, describe the range of accounts in a passage that has been quoted many times. In any case, the next 3 hours produced some of the most imaginative reporting of the war. Swarms of planes, or sometimes balloons, of all possible sizes, numbering from 1 to several hundred, traveling at altitudes which ranged from a few thousand feet to more than 20,000, and flying at speeds which were said to have varied from very slow to over 200 miles per hour. The phrase most imaginative reporting does significant work in that sentence. It acknowledges that the reports were extraordinary and contradictory, without directly calling the witnesses liars or fools. It is the language of institutional embarrassment, the polite, official way of saying we cannot make these accounts cohere, and we prefer not to speculate about what that means. Whatever was up there dropped no bombs, suffered no losses, and left no wreckage. And the people who saw it, some of them at least, described it with the specific and grounded certainty of people who are confident in what they are looking at. The pilots of the 4th Inceptor Command at Marchfield, the fighter pilots who would have scrambled to intercept any attacking aircraft, were briefed and led to their planes, and kept at readiness through the entire episode. But their commanders, unsure of the direction and scale of the threat, and deeply wary of sending their aircraft up into a sky full of friendly anti-aircraft fire, kept them on the ground. This is an often overlooked detail. Had actual enemy aircraft been present, the American fighter response would have been hamstrung by the very guns defending the city. The anti-aircraft barrage and the fighter response were, in structural terms, mutually exclusive. The density of flak in the sky over Los Angeles made it genuinely dangerous to fly through, for friend and foe alike. This is one of the inherent contradictions of urban anti-aircraft defense, and it would be recognized and gradually resolved in later years of the war as doctrines and technology improved. In February 1942, it was an unresolved tension that effectively left the city's fighter pilots sitting in their cockpits on the ground while the guns thundered overhead. It is also worth noting, in any accounting of the barrage, the sheer physical experience of being a civilian in Los Angeles on that morning. The guns were not a distant sound. They were positioned throughout the city, on rooftops and hilltops, and in open fields from the harbor to the San Fernando Valley. For anyone sleeping within several miles of an active battery, which meant most of the city, the sound was not a rumble on the horizon, but an immediate, physical presence, a rapid, overlapping series of concussive blasts that shook walls and rattled windows in their frames and reached into the body in the way that only very loud, very close sounds do. Sleep was simply impossible. People who had spent the preceding months trying to maintain some semblance of normal life while the Pacific War raged, rationing sugar and gasoline, reading casualty lists, worrying about sons and brothers and husbands in uniform, were now lying on their floors or crouching in their hallways, convinced by every piece of information available to them that the city was under attack. At 4:14 in the morning, a ceasefire was ordered. A few minutes later, the searchlights went out. The city sat in darkness, the smoke from 1,400 shells drifting slowly eastward in the offshore wind, and waited for sunrise. When the sun came up, there was nothing to show for it. No wreckage, no crater, no enemy dead. The only casualties were on the American side. 3 people had died from heart attacks during the chaos, and 2 more were killed in traffic accidents on the blacked out streets. Shrapnels from the anti-aircraft shells had damaged hundreds of buildings. An unexploded artillery round had embedded itself in the fairways of a Long Beach golf course. Several houses had been partially destroyed by shell fragments coming through their rooftops. In a preview of what was coming in the broader politics of wartime California, authorities arrested 20 Japanese Americans in the aftermath of the barrage on suspicion of trying to signal the mysterious aircraft. No evidence was ever produced against any of them. Chapter 6. The Morning After. The sun rose on a city in a state of profound uncertainty, and the uncertainty got more complicated with each passing hour. The Army and the Navy, who should in theory have been coordinating their account of the night's events, were instead publicly contradicting each other in real time, a spectacle that generated as much anxiety as the barrage itself. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, held a press conference on February 25th and said bluntly and definitively that the whole thing had been a false alarm attributable to jittery nerves. There had been no enemy aircraft. The Navy had found no evidence of enemy presence. It was, Knox said, a mistake. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, speaking for the Army, took a diametrically opposite position. Stimson insisted that as many as 15 unidentified aircraft had flown over Los Angeles that night, and suggested, without evidence he was willing to produce, that these might have been commercial aircraft operated by enemy agents flying from secret airfields in California or Mexico. The purpose of such a flight, he speculated, might have been to determine the location of American anti-aircraft defenses or to damage civilian morale. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, offered yet another theory. The incident had been caused by enemy agents deliberately flying aircraft over the city to provoke an incident and generate mass hysteria. Marshall later walked this back. The contradictions between Knox, Stimson, and Marshall were not subtle differences in emphasis. They were fundamental disagreements about whether enemy aircraft had been present at all, and the public, reading the morning papers and trying to make sense of what had happened, was left with an official record that pointed in 3 different directions simultaneously. The Los Angeles Times ran the story under a banner headline that took a clear position. Roaring out of a brilliant moonlit western sky, foreign aircraft flying both in large formation and singly flew over Southern California early today and drew heavy barrage of anti-aircraft fire, the first ever to sound over United States continental soil against an enemy invader. That is a confident piece of headline writing. The paper was presenting the enemy aircraft as fact. Representative Leland M. Ford of Santa Monica called for a congressional investigation and delivered a statement that has aged remarkably well. None of the explanations so far offered remove the episode from the category of complete mystification. This was either a practice raid or a raid to throw a scare into 2 million people, or a mistaken identity raid, or a raid to lay a political foundation to take away Southern California's war industries. Ford was, in one sentence, laying out essentially all of the serious theories that investigators and historians would spend the next 8 decades debating. There was also a cynical reading of the incident that circulated quickly and quietly, that the whole thing had been staged, or at least exaggerated by the military and political establishment to manufacture public support for the internment of Japanese Americans and the relocation of defense industries further inland, away from the coast. Executive Order 9066 had been signed just 6 days earlier, on February 19th. Oppositions to the internment program had not been negligible in California, and some observers noted with suspicion that the timing of the battle, 3 days after the order, 1 day after the most consequential West Coast attack of the war, was remarkably convenient for those who wanted to harden public opinion against Japanese Americans. This theory has never been substantiated. It remains in the category of cynical, but structurally possible speculation. What is clear is that the confusion of February 25, 1942, had real and lasting consequences beyond any single political decision. The American military and civilian defense apparatus on the West Coast had just fired 1,400 artillery shells into the night sky based on evidence that did not conclusively point to anything at all. And the Army and Navy could not subsequently agree on what had happened. In the hearts and mind of 2 million people who had lain awake listening to the guns, the war had come to their city, and nobody, not the people with guns and uniforms and authority, entirely knew what was out there. Chapter 7. The Science of What Happened. To understand the Battle of Los Angeles at a deeper level, it is worth spending some time with the science of what was happening, because this incident sits at the intersection of several fields of study that have only grown more sophisticated in the decades since 1942. And those fields of study throw considerable light on what the people in that city experienced. The first is the science of radar and its limitations in early operational use. Radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, works by transmitting pulses of radio waves and detecting the echoes that bounce back from objects in their path. The time delay between transmission and echo gives the distance, the direction of the antenna gives the bearing. The principle is clean, but in practice, especially in 1942, the technology was subject to a long list of phenomena that could generate false returns or mislead operators about the nature of what they were seeing. One of the most significant was and remains the phenomenon known as anomalous propagation, or AP, under certain atmospheric conditions, particularly when there is a temperature inversion layer, a zone where the air temperature increases with altitude rather than decreasing, creating a kind of atmospheric duct. Radar waves can travel far beyond their normal range, bending downward along the curvature of the Earth and reflecting off the ocean's surface or terrain features many miles beyond the horizon. This can produce radar returns that look, to an inexperienced operator, exactly like aircraft returns. Temperature inversions are extremely common off the California coast, particularly in the winter months, when the offshore marine layer, the thick blanket of cool, humid air that rolls in from the Pacific, interacts with the warmer continental air above it. Whether anomalous propagation contributed to the radar contact that triggered the Battle of Los Angeles is not definitively known, but the contact that appeared 120 miles west of the city shortly after 2 a.m., which apparently faded before reaching the coast, is consistent with an AP return from the ocean surface or from some atmospheric feature rather than from a physical aircraft. It is also worth understanding something about the specific limitations of early 1942 radar technology in California. The SCR-268 radar, which was the primary anti-aircraft fire control radar in American service at the start of the war, operated at a wavelength of approximately 1.5 meters and was designed specifically to provide fire control data, that is, precise azimuth and elevation, to anti-aircraft guns. Its maximum effective range was roughly 35 kilometers. The longer-range search radar, known as the SCR-270, the same model that had actually detected the incoming Japanese aircraft at Pearl Harbor, but whose operators tragically did not recognize the significance of what they were seeing, operated at longer wavelengths, and could detect objects at greater distances, but with less precision. In 1942, American radar operators on the California coast had been working with this equipment for only a few months, and the combination of new technology and inexperienced operators was a recognized problem in American coastal defense planning. What this means practically is that the radar contact detected 120 miles west of Los Angeles in the early hours of February 25th, the initial trigger that caused the blackout order, should be understood as a data point of very limited reliability. A contact at that range in those conditions, with operators of that experience level, could have been almost anything: an aircraft, a ship, a flock of birds, an atmospheric anomaly, or a malfunction. The operators reported what they saw because their training told them to report contacts. Their commanders issued the blackout order because their doctrine told them to take contact seriously. Both of these things are understandable. Neither of them establishes that there was actually an aircraft at that location. The second important piece of science is the well-documented psychology of perception under stress, particularly in conditions of low visibility and high ambient stimulation. Human visual perception under normal circumstances is remarkably good at filling in the gaps, at taking incomplete information and constructing a coherent picture from it, which is what allows us to recognize faces, read partially obscured text, navigate at twilight. Under conditions of extreme stress and high stakes, though, this same filling in function becomes overactive. The brain, primed by fear to look for threat, finds threats in ambiguous inputs. Searchlights crossing and recrossing in a smoke-filled sky, anti-aircraft shells detonating in brilliant flashes, tracer rounds streaking upward. All of this is extremely ambiguous visual information in the brain of a person who has been told to expect enemy aircraft, who has lived for 3 months in fear of attack, who is sleep-deprived and adrenaline-flooded, will interpret that ambiguity as confirmation of what it expects to see. This is the normal, predictable operation of the human perceptual system under conditions that it was not designed for. What psychologists call perceptual confirmation bias, or motivated perception. The exception shapes the perception. The Coast Artillery Association's 1949 analysis of the event made this point explicitly. Once firing started, imagination created all kinds of targets in the sky, and everyone joined in. This is a remarkably honest and precise description of what happens when the machinery of human perception intersects with the machinery of artillery fire in a dark sky. The shell bursts themselves, caught by the searchlights, were being mistaken for aircraft. The clouds of smoke generated by 1,400 detonating shells provided visual texture that minds under stress could organize into shapes. Shapes that looked, in the crossing light of dozens of searchlights, like aircraft in formation. Like a large craft moving slowly. Like whatever the mind had been trained to fear. There is a specific mechanism worth understanding here. The relationship between the act of firing the guns and the perception of targets. When an anti-aircraft battery fires, its crew undergoes a significant physiological state change. Adrenaline spikes, tunnel vision narrows the visual field, time perception distorts. The noise of the gun itself, enormous in close, triggers a startled response and then a heightened alert state. In this altered state of consciousness, the crew scanning the sky for targets is in precisely the condition most likely to produce false positive identifications. And each time a neighboring battery fires, validating, apparently, that someone else has seen something, the confirmation effect reinforces the perception. The guns were, in a very real sense, generating the target at which they appear to be firing. A third piece of science worth understanding is the meteorology of Southern California coast in February, specifically the weather balloon question. Weather balloons, also called meteorological balloons or radiosuns, were in widespread use by the American military in 1942 for measuring upper atmosphere conditions, temperature, humidity, wind speed, and direction at altitude. These balloons are typically made of latex or neoprene, inflated with hydrogen or helium to a diameter of several feet at launch, and they rise to altitudes of 80,000 to 100,000 feet before the decreasing atmospheric pressure causes them to expand and burst, releasing a small instrument package on a parachute. At night, under searchlight illumination, a weather balloon can appear surprisingly bright and substantial, its reflective surface catching the light and scattering it in ways that can make the balloon seem larger than it is, or more solid, or more distinct. The 1983 U.S. Office of Air Force History Analysis, the most comprehensive official analysis ever conducted, concluded that meteorological balloons released in the Los Angeles area in the hours before the incident were the most likely trigger for the initial alarm. Specifically, the report notes that at 3:06 a.m., a balloon carrying a red flare was spotted over Santa Monica, and that this observation triggered the opening fire from the first 4 batteries. The Army Air Force's own official history of the war, written while memories were still fresh, reaches the same conclusion. A careful study of the evidence suggests that meteorological balloons known to have been released over Los Angeles may well have caused the initial alarm. The United States Coast Artillery Association, in a 1949 analysis, went further, noting that records showed a balloon had been released at approximately 1 a.m. on the morning of February 25th, more than an hour before the first radar contact, and that this balloon started all the shooting. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated. A weather balloon cannot fully explain all of the observations that night. Weather balloons do not hold formation. They do not travel at consistent speeds. A single balloon drifting on the wind cannot simultaneously account for reports of aircraft at multiple locations across a 40-mile arc, traveling at different speeds and altitude over the course of an hour. The balloon hypothesis, if there was only one balloon, only fully accounts for the first trigger. What followed was something more complex, a combination of the initial balloon, or possibly multiple balloons, since the Army routinely released more than one, the perceptual effects described above, and potentially other unidentified objects about which no one is certain. This is the honest assessment of the evidence. The balloon hypothesis is the most likely explanation for the triggering event, and the cascade of reports that followed is most likely explained by war nerves, perceptual confirmation bias, and the visual chaos of more than 1,400 exploding shells generating their own apparent targets in a smoke-filled, searchlight-swept sky. But most likely is not the same as definitively proven. In the residue of genuine uncertainty, the part of the event that don't quite fit the neat balloon in nerves explanation is real, and it has been the engine of serious inquiry and less serious speculation ever since. Chapter 8. The Theories. We now discuss every serious and not so serious theory about the Battle of Los Angeles, with its evidence laid out, its internal logic traced. There are broadly 5 theories that have commanded serious attention over the past 80 years. They are not all equally supported by the evidence, but they are all grounded in real observations and real questions. The weather balloon theory. This is the official consensus explanation, and it is the one endorsed by the most authoritative analyses of the event. The 1983 study conducted by the U.S. Office of Air Force History, which represents the most comprehensive official investigation ever conducted into the incident, concluded that meteorological balloons released in the Los Angeles area were the most plausible trigger. The Army Air Force's own official history, written in the late 1940s, while memories were still recent, reached a similar conclusion. The Coast Artillery Association's 1949 analysis was the most specific. It identified records of balloons released at approximately 1 a.m. on the morning of February 25th, more than an hour before the radar contact, and stated plainly that this balloon started all the shooting, adding that once the firing started, imagination created all kinds of targets in the sky and everyone joined in. The specific triggering event described in the official records is the sighting of a balloon carrying a red flare over Santa Monica at 3:06 a.m., which caused 4 batteries of anti-aircraft artillery to open fire simultaneously, at which point, as the official history so evocatively put it, the air over Los Angeles erupted like a volcano. In this account, the balloon was real, the first barrage was real, and everything that followed was a cascade effect driven by sympathetic firing, perceptual confirmation bias, and the visual chaos generated by the barrage itself. The strength of the weather balloon theory is that it requires no unusual assumptions. It is grounded in documented procedures. The Army routinely released weather balloons for meteorological observation. In documented technology, the radar limitations of early 1942 are well established. And in well-understood psychology, the dynamics of mass perception under stress are not controversial in the scientific literature. It does not require Japan to have lied about its operations. It does not require a government conspiracy. It fits the physical evidence, or rather, the absence of physical evidence, since no wreckage and no crater point toward either no aircraft or aircraft that weren't shot down. But for a balloon in the absence of wreckage is simply what you would expect. And yet, The weather balloon theory has problems that its advocates sometimes minimize, and those problems deserve to be stated clearly. The first and most serious is the durability of the object under fire. Anti-aircraft shells of the type fired that night, 12.8-pound shells with a time-fused detonation system, do not need a direct hit to destroy a weather balloon. They create a lethal burst radius of lethal fragments. A balloon made of latex or neoprene floating at altitude would not survive the near miss of a fragmenting anti-aircraft shell. It would be torn apart quickly, yet the object described by the most consistent categories of witnesses, the large, slow orange object tracked from Santa Monica to Long Beach over 30 minutes, appeared to be completely unaffected by the barrage. If hundreds of rounds were fired in its general vicinity, and it continued unperturbed on its course, the balloon explanation requires us to accept that not a single one of those hundreds of rounds detonated close enough to damage it. That is possible. Over a 40-mile arc of the city, with guns firing in multiple directions, it is plausible that a drifting balloon might have been upwind of most of the fire and simply never accurately targeted, but it is not comfortable. The second problem is scale. Weather balloons are small, typically a few feet to perhaps 10 feet in diameter at launch altitude. The witnesses who described what they saw through binoculars used words like large, globular, and enormous. A weather balloon at the altitude described, anywhere from a few thousand to 20,000 feet, would not appear large through binoculars. It would appear small. The discrepancy between the stated size of a weather balloon and the perceived size of what witnesses described is not trivial. The third problem is the plurality of reports. The weather balloon theory works best as an explanation for a single triggering event, but the reports that came in over the subsequent hour described objects at radically different locations simultaneously, near Long Beach, over Culver City, above Hollywood, over the harbor. A single balloon cannot be in multiple places at once. Proponents of the balloon theory respond that there were likely multiple balloons. The Army routinely released more than one, and that the subsequent reports were generated by the chaos of the barrage rather than additional objects. This may be true, but it means the theory has to do increasing amount of explanation work as each new sighting is added to the account. None of this makes the balloon theory wrong. It remains the most parsimonious and well-supported explanation available. But acknowledging its problems, honestly, is necessary for a fair accounting of the evidence. The Japanese reconnaissance aircraft theory. This was the Army's initial official position, maintained by the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, in the days after the event, and supported by General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army. The theory holds that one or more Japanese aircraft flew over Los Angeles during the barrage, not in a combat role, not dropping bombs, but on a reconnaissance mission, observing American defensive position, probing the coastal response, gauging the reaction of the civilian population, and perhaps assessing the feasibility of a future strike. This theory deserves more serious treatment than it often receives, because the operational capacity it describes actually existed. Japan did possess submarines capable of launching float planes, the type B-1 submarines of the I-15 class, the same class as the I-17 that had shelled Elwood just the night before, could carry a Yokosuka E-14Y reconnaissance floatplane in a waterproof hangar forward of the conning tower. The plane could be assembled, launched from the water surface, and recovered after landing alongside the submarine. The operational range of the I-17 and its sister boats was extraordinary, well over 10,000 nautical miles, enough to operate indefinitely off the California coast. And Japan's submarines were, in February of 1942, already prowling those very waters. A Japanese float plane launched from a submarine 40 or 50 miles offshore, flying at altitude over a blacked-out city, would have been nearly impossible to intercept in early 1942. American night fighter capability was extremely limited at that stage of the war. The float plane would have been very slow. Its top speed was around 150 miles per hour, which is consistent with some of the witness descriptions. It would have been small and hard to see against a dark sky, making it possible that the guns never achieved a firing solution on it. After its pass over the city, it could have returned to the submarine, been recovered, and been on its way long before daylight came. The Japanese Navy did, in fact, launch submarine-based float-plane missions against the American mainland on 2 separate occasions during the war, both against Oregon, on September 1942, where float planes drop incendiary device on forests. This is documented history. If the Japanese were willing to fly float planes from submarines against Oregon coast in September of 1942, the question of whether they were willing or able to do the same thing against California in February 1942, when submarines were already off the coast and the military was already at high tension from the Elwood shelling, is not absurd. The reconstruction of events offered by some historians who take this theory seriously goes like this. A single Japanese float plane, or possibly 2, flew a reconnaissance pass over the Los Angeles area in the early morning of February 25th. It was spotted by alert lookouts, tracked briefly by radar before radar operators lost the contact and noise, and then triggered the defensive response when it appeared over the city. The subsequent barrage, with all its chaos and confusion, created far more visual information than the small, slow plane itself could ever have generated, leading to wildly divergent accounts of swarms of aircraft at multiple altitudes. The actual plane, or planes, flew through the chaos, observed what they came to observe, and returned to the submarine. The absence of wreckage is simply explained because they weren't shot down. The fatal weakness of this theory is Japan's post-war confirmation that no such mission took place. After the war ended, the Japanese government reviewed its operational records and stated unambiguously that no Japanese aircraft were over Los Angeles on the night of February 24th through 25th, 1942. Japanese military record-keeping was meticulous, and no such mission appeared in any archival source. Japanese military historians across multiple decades have been consistent on this point. The counter-argument offered by people who remain open to the Japanese aircraft theory is that a mission of this sensitivity might not have been recorded in standard operational logs, or might have been recorded in documentation that was destroyed as the war turned against Japan. Japan destroyed enormous quantities of military records in 1945, both before and during the American occupation, specifically to prevent incriminating information from falling into Allied hands. The absence of documentation in surviving records is not, in this view, definitive proof that the mission never happened. This is a structurally valid point. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when the evidence in question might have been deliberately destroyed. But the counter-argument must be weighted against the weight of what we do have. The entirety of surviving Japanese submarine records from that period shows no such mission, and multiple Japanese naval historians with full access to what was preserved have found nothing. The balance of evidence, while not absolutely conclusive, weighs heavily against this theory. The secret airfield and enemy agent theory. Secretary of War Stimson, General Marshall, and several others in the immediate aftermath offered a variation on the Japanese aircraft theory that shifted the source of the aircraft from the Imperial Navy to enemy agents operating covertly within the continental United States or from bases in Mexico. In this version, the aircraft over Los Angeles were not Japanese military planes launched from submarines, but commercial or light aircraft operated by enemy agents, Japanese intelligence operatives, or sympathizers flying from secret airstrips in Baja California or the California Central Valley, with the purpose of mapping American defenses, probing the coastal response, or simply generating public panic. The appeal of this theory is that it sidesteps the problem of Japan's official denial. If the aircraft were operated by agents rather than regular military, they might not appear in Japanese military records at all. It also fits a certain wartime psychological template: the enemy within, the fifth column, the saboteur in civilian clothes, that was deeply powerful in 1942 and shaped a great deal of wartime policy, including the internment of Japanese Americans. The evidentiary problems are severe, however. Military and FBI intelligence investigations conducted both during and after the war found no evidence of secret airfields anywhere in California or Baja California. The operational footprint of running a clandestine air operation, hangar facilities, fuel, maintenance equipment, ground crew, communication, would have been very difficult to conceal entirely from wartime intelligence, which was actively looking for exactly this kind of infrastructure. No aircraft consistent with this theory was ever identified, tracked, or recovered. And the operational logic, as with the direct Japanese aircraft theory, requires us to accept that a pilot willingly flew a small light aircraft through the most intense anti-aircraft barrage in the history of the American home front and emerged unscathed and undetected. General Marshall himself walked back his initial claims within days. This is significant. Marshall was not a man given to imprecision or public recantations without reason. His retreat from the enemy agent's position suggests that the intelligence reports on which it was based quickly evaporated under scrutiny, leaving nothing to stand on. The false flag theory. The false flag theory is the most politically uncomfortable of the conventional explanations, and it is worth engaging with honestly rather than dismissing it as conspiracy thinking, because its circumstantial logic is not frivolous. The theory holds that American military or political authorities either deliberately staged the incident or, more plausibly, allowed the small real threat to be amplified and escalated without intervention in order to serve specific political purposes. The timing is the starting point of this argument, and it is frankly striking. Executive Order 9066, the order authorizing the forced removal of Japanese Americans from their homes, had been signed just 6 days earlier on February 19th. At the time of its signing, the order faced meaningful opposition not just from Japanese American communities and a handful of civil liberties advocates, but from some within the military and government who believed the mass internment of American citizens on the basis of ancestry was legally untenable and operationally unnecessary. The FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, not generally considered a champion of civil liberties, had reported to the White House that existing law enforcement mechanisms were adequate to address any genuine security threats from Japanese Americans without mass internment. In this political context, a dramatic attack on Los Angeles, or the credible appearance of one, would have been extraordinarily useful to those pushing for rapid implementation of the order. It would have silenced opposition. It would have generated public fury and fear. It would have made the abstract threat concrete and immediate. And it would have directly implicated Japanese Americans in the public imagination, especially if the arrests of 20 Japanese Americans on suspicion of signaling the attack aircraft were given prominent coverage, which they were. Representative Leland Ford noticed this logic at the time. His famous statement that the incident was either a practice raid or a raid to throw a scare into 2 million people, or a mistaken identity raid, or a raid to lay political foundation to take away Southern California's war industries, was not idle political grandstanding. Ford was explicitly identifying the political utility of the incident in asking publicly whether it might have been manufactured to serve it. The physical evidence, however, has often been used to argue against a staged event. Critics point to the shrapnel damage across hundreds of buildings, the unexploded round in Long Beach Golf Course, the structural damage from shells coming through rooftops, and say, this is clearly genuine, uncontrolled defensive fire, not a managed performance. That observation is correct, but it proves far less than what is usually taken to prove. The false flag theory does not require that the barrage itself be controlled. A trigger and a response are two entirely separate things. If someone with access to Coastal Defense Network, a senior officer, a well-placed official, an agent with knowledge of the early warning procedures, introduced a triggering event into the system deliberately, the panic and the barrage that followed would have been entirely real, entirely uncontrolled, and entirely genuine. Hundreds of young soldiers firing in the dark at whatever their commanders told them was there would produce exactly the chaotic, messy, self-contradictory pattern that the evidence shows. The orchestrators of a false flag need not control a single gun. They only need to light the fuse. The explosion takes care of itself. This distinction maps directly onto well-documented historical operations. The Gleiwitz incident in 1939, in which German SS operatives faked a Polish attack on a German radio station to justify the invasion of Poland, required a handful of people to manufacture a triggering incident, after which genuine German military forces responded to a provocation they did not know was fabricated. The trigger was controlled. The response was real. The soldiers who crossed the border the next morning were not in on it. The model requires very few people at the point of manufacture and generates enormous, unmanageable consequences downstream. Applied to Los Angeles, the question is not whether the gun crew at the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade were acting under false pretenses. They almost certainly were not, in either the conventional or the false flag account. The question is whether whoever introduced the initial triggering event into the alert network did so deliberately. That person or persons would have needed to know only a few things. That the Coastal Defense Network was on heightened alert after Elwood, that a report of an inbound contact would automatically trigger a blackout, and that in the atmosphere of February 25, 1942, a blackout plus searchlights plus the first gun firing would cascade into a full barrage essentially on its own. The chaos that followed would be exactly what they needed, and they would have needed no further involvement. The most penetrating argument against the false flag theory, then, is who specifically, at what level of command, would have had both the motive and the access to introduce a false contact into the alert network without leaving a paper trail. And would that person have been willing to accept that 5 Americans might die in traffic accidents and heart attacks as a result? Those are genuine questions without clear answers. And the Navy's immediate and public contradiction of the Army's account is worth noting, not as proof against the theory, but as evidence that if a trigger was manufactured, the Navy either wasn't read in or actively disagreed with the narrative being built around the event afterward. None of this establishes that the false flag theory is correct, but it means the standard dismissal, the chaos was real, therefore nothing was staged, is not a valid argument, and the theory deserves to remain on the table with its actual strengths and weaknesses intact. The UFO and extraterrestrial theory. And now we arrive at the theory that has given the Battle of Los Angeles most of its cultural life, and that has attracted, over the decades, the most sustained and varied attention from researchers outside the mainstream military historical tradition. It should be said, at the outset, that the extraterrestrial theory did not exist in February 1942. The concept of alien spacecraft visiting Earth, in the specific sense that the term UFO came to represent after 1947, had not yet crystallized in American popular culture. Contemporary accounts of the battle focused entirely on Japanese aircraft, weather balloons, or simple confusion. No newspapers in the immediate aftermath speculated about visitors from another world. No official record contains any such suggestion. The alien interpretation was retroactively applied to the event, beginning in the early 1950s, by writers and researchers who were working with the new interpretive framework that the Kenneth Arnold sighting in the Roswell incident had provided. This matters because it means the UFO interpretation of the Battle of Los Angeles is not a primary source account. It is a later reading of primary source accounts through a lens that did not exist when those accounts were created. This does not automatically invalidate it. Later interpretive frameworks can reveal things that earlier observers missed, but it is relevant context for how to weigh it. The case for the extraterrestrial interpretation rests on several interlocking observations. First, the witness testimony. As described in previous chapter, a consistent subset of witnesses, trained observers with binoculars, from elevated positions with clear sightlines, described a single large orange slow-moving object traversing the city from northwest to southeast over approximately 30 minutes. The consistency of this description across independent witnesses is notable. These witnesses did not describe the swarms and formations that appear in other accounts. They described one thing, moving steadily in one direction, unperturbed by everything being fired at it. If this testimony is accurate, and there is no obvious reasons to dismiss those specific witnesses more than any others, then what they describe does not match a weather balloon in several important respects: the apparent size, the apparent color, and the apparent durability. Second, the behavior of the object. UFO researchers point out that the object, as described by these witnesses, did not behave like any aircraft in the 1942 inventory of any nation. It made no attempt to evade, never accelerated, never changed course or altitude. It simply proceeded at a steady, unhurried speed, apparently indifferent to the barrage around it, behavior that researchers describe as consistent with a craft operating under some form of protection that rendered conventional weapons ineffective, or simply far more advanced than anything in existence at the time. The absence of any resolution after 80 years also figures into the ufological case. Japan denied sending aircraft. The Army and Navy contradicted each other publicly. No wreckage was ever recovered. The official investigation reached a conclusion: weather balloons. But that conclusion was acknowledged even at the time to be provisional and incomplete. And the decades of sustained interest from witnesses who were there and remained unconvinced suggests the explanation has never been fully persuasive to everyone who experienced the night firsthand. Fourth, the photograph. The famous retouched Los Angeles Times photograph has been central to the UFO case since the early 1950s. Ufologists argue that even after accounting for the retouching, the original negative shows multiple searchlight beams converging on a central point, which requires there to have been something at that point for the searchlight operators to train their beams on. Searchlights are not trained randomly, they are trained on targets. Whatever was at the convergence point of 6 or more searchlight beams was something, even if the photograph's retouching obscured its shape. This is actually a reasonable point, and it is worth separating from the broader photograph debate. The retouching analysis tells us that the disc-shaped appearance of the object in the published image cannot be trusted as evidence of a disc, but it says nothing about whether there was something at the convergence point of those searchlights. Multiple searchlight operators independently trained their beams on the same location, which means something was there. That much is beyond dispute. UFO researcher David Marler, who has examined the original negative at the Los Angeles Times archives, has noted that while the retouching clearly affected the apparent shape and solidity of the object, the base geometry of the searchlight convergence is present in the original negative. The beams are converging on something, and Marler, careful not to speculate about what, observes that multiple independent searchlight operators appear to have been working in coordination on a common focal point. The honest assessment of the UFO theory, the assessment that takes it seriously without endorsing it uncritically, is this: the witness testimony of a large, slow, orange, apparently indestructible object traversing the city is genuinely difficult to account for with the balloon explanation alone. The UFO interpretation offers an explanation that accommodates these specific observations. A craft of non-human technology would explain why 1,400 rounds had no visible effects, why no wreckage was found, why Japan denied involvement, and why the official account has never been fully satisfying to the people who were there. The explanation is extraordinary and requires accepting assumptions for which there is no direct confirming evidence, but it is built on real observations by real witnesses, and dismissing it out of hand requires dismissing those witnesses. Where the UFO theory runs short is physical evidence. There is no wreckage, no recovered material, no instrumentally recorded data from that night that unambiguously establishes the presence of a non-human craft. Witness testimony, even when consistent and credible, is not sufficient by itself to establish a claim of this magnitude, and the evidence has not been produced in the decades since. The theory remains in the category of genuinely interesting possibilities that the available record neither supports definitively nor fully excludes. Chapter 9. What they saw is what they saw. There is a point that gets lost in almost every conventional account of Battle of Los Angeles. The argument is sometimes made, often dismissively, that the extraterrestrial interpretation of the Battle of Los Angeles cannot be taken seriously because the people who were there in 1942 did not describe what they saw in UFO terms. They didn't use the word saucer, they didn't talk about alien craft, they talked about planes or balloons or lights, the vocabulary available to them. And so the argument goes, the UFO reading of the event is a projection backward from a cultural moment that hadn't happened yet and should be treated as such. This argument sounds reasonable on its surface, but it contains a significant logical error. The absence of a word is not the absence of a thing. In 1942, there was no cultural vocabulary for unidentified craft of unknown origin exhibiting non-standard flight characteristics. That vocabulary didn't exist yet. It was coined in its modern form 5 years later. But the absence of that vocabulary did not prevent people from seeing what they saw. It only prevented them from categorizing it accurately within the available conceptual framework. When witnesses in 1942 looked up at something large and orange and apparently impervious to anti-aircraft shells and called it a plane because that was the closest available word, that is not evidence that what they saw was a plane. It is evidence that their language lagged behind their experience, which is something that happens routinely in human history when people encounter things that have not yet been named. Think about the parallel in any other field. For most of human history, people watched the night sky and saw wandering points of light they called planets. The Greek word simply means wanderers, with no framework for understanding that these were other worlds orbiting the same star. When medieval Europeans described the aurora borealis, they called it dancing lights or attributed it to supernatural causes because atmospheric plasma physics was not part of their conceptual toolkit. The experience was real. The categorization was limited by the available vocabulary and knowledge. Later generations with better tools retroactively understood what those observers had been looking at. That process of retroactive categorization is not distortion. It is how knowledge advances. Applying this to Los Angeles, the witnesses in February 1942 who described a large, slow, orange, apparently indestructible object moving through the sky over the city were describing an experience. What they saw is what they saw. The question of how to categorize it, balloon, plane, Japanese aircraft, atmospheric phenomenon, something without a name, is separate from the experience itself. The retroactive application of the UAP-UFO category to their account is not in itself an error of reasoning. It is the use of a more precise category, developed later, to describe experiences that outran the vocabulary of their time. Whether the category ultimately fits is a question that should be settled by examining the evidence, not by pointing to the calendar. This matters because a significant rhetorical move in the official dismissal of the Battle of Los Angeles has been to conflate the UFO label with extraterrestrial claims, use the extraterrestrial claims to make the whole subject seem ridiculous, and then allow that ridicule to do the work of discrediting the underlying witness testimony. This is not careful thinking. It is a way of short-circuiting inquiry. The witness testimony exists independently of any particular theory about what those witnesses saw. A person who describes a large orange slow-moving object that survived sustained anti-aircraft fire is describing something specific and real, whatever its ultimate origin. The testimony deserves to be engaged with on its own terms, not dismissed because it has been associated with theories that are easy to mock. And then there is the harder question, the one that the conventional account tends to avoid with the most conspicuous delicacy. If the thing that flew over Los Angeles that night was genuinely unusual, not Japanese planes, not weather balloons, something else, what would the institutional incentive have been, and what would the cover-up actually have looked like? This requires thinking about what cover-up actually means in a governmental context, because the word tends to invoke dramatic imagery, secret meetings, sworn oaths, men in black. That is not how institutional concealment actually operates most of the time. Most institutional concealment is mundane. It is bureaucrats choosing the explanation that creates the fewest problems. It is officers writing reports that protect their commands. It is politicians reaching for the narrative that serves the immediate need. It rarely requires conscious coordination across many people because the incentive structures in large institutions naturally produce convergent behavior without explicit conspiracy. In February 1942, consider what the American military command would have faced if the object over Los Angeles had been something genuinely unknown and anomalous. The country had been at war for 10 weeks. Public confidence in the military's ability to defend the homeland was fragile. Pearl Harbor had just demonstrated catastrophically that the American military could be surprised and overwhelmed. The last thing the Army and Navy needed in the middle of mobilizing an entire nation for total war was public confrontation with the possibility that something was flying over major American cities that American guns could not damage and American command could not identify or explain. The psychological impact of that omission on civilian morale and on military recruitment and the war bond program would have been severe. The weather balloon explanation, whatever its evidentiary merits, served a clear institutional need. It closed the incident, attributed it to human error and equipment limitations, and allowed the military to move forward without confronting the possibility of an unknown threat that it had no tools to address. It did not require anyone to lie in a conscious, deliberate way. It required only that the people with authority to choose the explanation that was most manageable. In a wartime military bureaucracy operating under enormous pressure, that kind of preference for manageable explanations over difficult ones is not a conspiracy. It is the default mode of institutional behavior. There is also a specific dimension of the cover-up question that relates to the technology of 1942. If the object over Los Angeles was something that could absorb 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft fire without damage or deflection, that fact alone would have been extraordinarily alarming to any military command, not because it proved extraterrestrial origin, but because it demonstrated the existence of a technology or material that American weapons could not penetrate. In wartime, The discovery that an unidentified aircraft is invulnerable to your anti-aircraft guns is not a reassuring finding. It would have been classified immediately, not because someone was covering up aliens, but because the tactical and strategic implications of invulnerable aerial craft are profound, and the military does not share information about its own vulnerabilities in the middle of a war. So even if we set aside the extraterrestrial question entirely and simply ask, what if something genuinely unusual flew over Los Angeles, origin unknown, that American guns demonstrably could not harm? The institutional response would have been predictably and almost automatically to suppress that specific finding and offer a more comfortable alternative, not out of malice, out of the ordinary logic of wartime secrecy applied to an uncomfortable observation. The congressional investigation that Representative Ford demanded was never conducted. That is a fact. The explanation that the Army's Western Defense Command settled on, weather balloons and war nerves, was reached within days, without a serious formal investigation, and was adopted as the official account despite the Army and Navy's own inability to agree on whether aircraft had been present at all. The 1983 Air Force History Study is the most thorough analysis ever officially conducted, and it was done 40 years after the fact, from documentary record, without the ability to interview the witnesses who had been most specific about what they observed. That is a thin investigative record for an event of this magnitude, and the thinness of it is not obviously accidental. None of this is sufficient to conclude that something extraordinary flew over Los Angeles on the morning of February 25, 1942. The chain of reasoning runs, something might have been unusual, the official explanation might have been chosen for a reason other than accuracy, therefore the extraordinary hypothesis should not be dismissed. That chain is logically valid, but it doesn't establish the extraordinary hypothesis on its own. What it does is establish that the institutional record cannot be taken as a neutral, disinterested account of the evidence, which is meaningfully different from establishing what actually happened. The witnesses who said they saw something that was not a balloon, and who were told by government spokesperson, by newspaper editorial writers, by the slow cultural consensus that calcified around the official explanation, that they were mistaken, or frightened, or imaginative, deserve at minimum to have their testimony treated as potentially accurate. The gap between probably weather balloons and definitely weather balloons is where the Battle of Los Angeles still lives 80 years on. And the institutional reasons that gap has never been fully closed are worth understanding as clearly as the meteorology. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Los Angeles was, in many ways, more revealing than the battle itself. In the hours after dawn, as the smoke cleared and the reality of no enemy planes, no bombs, no craters settled over the city, there was a period of profound collective embarrassment. 2 million people had been terrified through the night. The military had fired 1,400 shells at what appeared to be nothing. 5 people were dead. The Army and Navy were publicly contradicting each other, and Representative Ford's demand for a congressional investigation was gaining traction, not just from opposition politicians, but from ordinary Angelenos who had spent the night convinced they were under attack and were now being told by at least one branch of the government that the whole thing had been jittery nerves. The 20 Japanese Americans arrested in the aftermath on suspicion of signaling enemy aircraft were quietly released without charge because there had never been any evidence against them at all. But the arrests were a preview, brutal and specific, of what Executive Order 9066 was about to do to an entire community. Within weeks of the Battle of Los Angeles, the mass removal and internment of Japanese Americans began. More than 120,000 people, 2/3 of them American citizens, many of them California-born, many of them farmers and fishermen and shopkeepers and students, were ordered to leave their homes, sell or abandon their property, and report to assembly centers that would eventually become the 10 internment camps scattered across the arid interior of the American West. The legal mechanism of this removal cited the possibility of enemy espionage and sabotage, the very fears that the Elwood bombardment and the Battle of Los Angeles had inflamed. The connection between these events and the internment is not straightforward causation. The order had been signed before the battle, and the bureaucratic machinery was already in motion. But historians have consistently noted that the climate of fear generated by the coastal incidents of late February 1942 silenced much of the remaining public opposition to the policy and made the removal process with a speed and comprehensiveness that might otherwise have been politically impossible. For those 120,000 people stripped of their homes, their businesses, their liberty, many of them losing everything they had built over lifetimes, the battle in the sky over Los Angeles was not an amusing wartime mystery. It was one of the last events before a profound and lasting injustice. The 10 internment camps, Manzanar and Tule Lake in California, Topaz in Utah, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Granada in Colorado, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, Jerome and Rower in Arkansas, were built in some of the most inhospitable terrain in the American West: high desert, bitter winter, scorching summer, dust. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed soldiers. Inmates lived in tar paper barracks, hastily constructed with green lumber that shrank as it dried, leaving gaps through which the desert wind blew constantly. Families lost farm they had cultivated for decades, fishing boats, businesses established over generations, sold at distressed prices in the panic days before removal, or simply abandoned. The human cost was staggering, measured not only in property, but in disrupted education, broken careers, psychological damage, and the deep humiliation of being treated as an enemy in your own country. The congressional investigation demanded by Representative Ford was never really conducted. The political machinery of wartime was not interested in a serious public accounting of what had happened. The incident was largely filed under wartime confusion and moved on, except, of course, in the minds of people who had lived through it, who kept the memory alive in the way that people always do when official explanations don't quite satisfy. For the soldiers who had manned the guns that night, the young men of the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade, many of them National Guardsmen from Washington and Oregon, who had been deployed to California after Pearl Harbor. The battle became a story they told their families and then didn't tell much anymore, because telling it invited either ridicule or later questions about aliens that they found equally uncomfortable. The the Fort MacArthur Museum in San Pedro, located at the entrance to Los Angeles Harbor, has done the most to preserve those memories, hosting an annual commemoration of the event and collecting oral histories from survivors. As the museum's director Stephen Nelson observed after interviewing roughly 10 veterans who were there, the basic gist is that they did what they were told to do. That is, in the end, perhaps the most human and most important thing to understand about the people who were there. They were young men in a frightened city who had been told to protect it, warned to expect an attack, and who opened fire the way they had been trained. The information feeding those reports turned out to be wrong. The context was maddening in its ambiguity, and the result was one of the most extraordinary nights in the history of the American home front. Chapter 11: Japan's Other Attacks. One of the things that makes Battle of Los Angeles so genuinely complex is that while no Japanese aircraft flew over Los Angeles that night, Japan was in fact attempting throughout the war to attack the American mainland in a variety of ways. The threat that California's defenders feared were not imaginary. They were real, just not on the night of February 25th, manifesting as aircraft over the city. The Japanese military's interest in attacking the continental United States was serious and sustained. The Elwood shelling was only the most visible of several submarine-based attacks. In June 1942, just 4 months after the Battle of Los Angeles, Japanese submarine I-25 surfaced off the Oregon coast and shelled Fort Stevens on the Columbia River, making it the only American military installation in the continental United States to be fired upon by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812. The shelling caused minimal damage, but the point was made. Later, in 1942, the I-25 returned to Oregon on a different kind of mission. The submarine had been modified to carry a small float plane, a Yokosuka E-14Y, a single-engine reconnaissance biplane small enough to be stored in a waterproof hangar on the submarine's deck. In September 1942, Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita flew 2 missions over the forests of southwestern Oregon, dropping incendiary bombs in hopes of starting forest fires that would divert American resources and generate public panic. The fires he started were quickly contained by local firefighters, and the operational results were negligible. But the mission demonstrated that Japanese submarines could, in fact, launch aircraft against the American mainland, and this knowledge colored every subsequent discussion of what might have been over Los Angeles. The most obvious and in some ways most remarkable Japanese attack on the American mainland was the Fugo program, the fire balloon campaign. Between November 1944 and early 1945, Japan launched somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 balloon bombs, known as Fugo, across the Pacific toward North America. These were extraordinary objects, paper and rubberized silk balloons about 30 feet in diameter, filled with hydrogen, carrying incendiary and anti-personnel bombs on a gondola suspended below, designed to ride the jet stream eastward across the Pacific and drop their bombs on American forests and cities. The jet stream is a narrow band of very fast-moving air at high altitude, typically between 30,000 and 40,000 feet, that flows from west to east across the northern Pacific, driven by the temperature differential between the equatorial tropics and the polar regions. Its existence had been hypothesized by meteorologists for decades. but its specific characteristics over the Pacific have been documented by Japanese high-altitude research balloons in the late 1930s. Japanese scientists understood that the jet stream over the Pacific moved at average speeds of 100 to 200 miles per hour, and that a balloon carried by it could cross the Pacific in 3 to 5 days, putting it over North America in roughly the time it took for a ship to make the same journey. The engineering challenge was keeping the balloon at the right altitude to stay in the jet stream for the entire crossing, which required an automatic altitude control system. Sand ballast released automatically when the balloon descended below the target altitude, and the hydrogen vented when it rose too high. For its time, the Fugo's altitude control system was genuinely sophisticated. Of the 9,000 plus Fugo launched, perhaps 300 reached North America. Most landed in uninhabited forest or open land. Several were found as far east as Michigan and Iowa. One struck a power line in Washington state and briefly knocked out power to a nuclear facility involved in the Manhattan Project, the most operationally significant result of the entire campaign. And one in May 1945 killed 6 Americans, a minister's wife and 5 children from Bly, Oregon, who found one of the balloons in the woods and inadvertently triggered it. The only combat casualties on the American mainland during the Second World War. Japan was genuinely trying to reach the American mainland throughout the war, by multiple means. The methods actually used, submarine-based shelling, floatplane incendiary drops, balloon bombs, were different from the massed air raid formation that gun crews imagined in the smoke over Los Angeles, but the underlying premise of the defensive posture was not irrational. Chapter 12. The Long Afterlife. The Battle of Los Angeles slept, more or less, for a few years after the war ended. It was a wartime embarrassment that the military preferred not to dwell on, and the official explanations, jittery nerves, weather balloons, false alarm, were widely accepted by most people who thought about it at all. The New York Times had, in March 1942, noted with a kind of arch amusement that it was fitting for Hollywood, the world's capital of manufactured illusions, to have hosted a battle that turned out to be just another illusion. For a while, the incident seemed to belong in that register, a curious footnote, an example of how fear can lead capable men to do absurd things. In 1947, things changed. Kenneth Arnold's flying saucer sighting in June, followed by the Roswell incident in July, in the rapid flowering of UFO culture that followed in the late 1940s and early 1950s, created a new interpretive grid through which earlier events could be reread. UFO researchers and writers, surveying the historical record for unexplained aerial sightings, naturally landed on the Battle of Los Angeles. Here was an event, thoroughly documented, reported on by major newspapers, confirmed by military records, in which unidentified objects in the sky had resisted artillery fire, left no wreckage, and produced officially contradictory explanations. In the developing language of the UFO movement, this was a classic case. The photograph helped enormously. The retouched Los Angeles Times image, with its dramatic disc-shaped object at the apex of converging searchlights, became one of the iconic images of early UFO literature. It appeared in books, in newsletters, in the news magazines devoted to flying saucer reports. Without the historical context of photographic retouching, which was not something that ordinary readers in the 1950s and 1960s necessarily knew or thought about. The image was visually powerful. The Steven Spielberg film 1941, released in 1979, Spielberg's one genuinely unsuccessful major production, was loosely based on the Battle of Los Angeles, transposing it to the days immediately following Pearl Harbor and playing it for broad comedy. The film depicted a bumbling Japanese submarine crew and equally bumbling American defenders generating chaos that destroys a Santa Monica amusement park. It was not a critical success, and Spielberg himself has described it as the most unpleasant film I made, but it cemented the Battle of Los Angeles in popular consciousness as a wartime absurdity, a story about what happens when fear outpaces common sense. The more recent and more seriously intended pop culture engagement with the battle is the 2011 film Battle Los Angeles, a military science fiction action film that imagines the night of February 25, 1942, as the beginning of an alien invasion that the world has been too frightened to acknowledge. The film's marketing was clever. It used the real historical event, and specifically the retouched Los Angeles Times photograph, as anchoring material for its promotional campaign, presenting the 1942 incident as suppressed evidence of genuine extraterrestrial contact. The Times writer Harry Harnage noted acidly that if the film's publicity had been deliberately designed to discredit UFO research by using manipulated photographs as true historical material, it could not have done a better job. The Fort MacArthur Museum at the entrance to Los Angeles Harbor in San Pedro has become the most serious institutional custodian of the event's memory. Every February, on the anniversary of the battle, the museum hosts a commemorative event, the Great LA Air Raid of 1942, that has grown into something genuinely popular, drawing both military history enthusiasts and UFO researchers, in managing to hold those two audiences in a kind of productive tension. The museum's director, Stephen Nelson, spent years interviewing veterans of the batteries. In his research, consistently cited in serious accounts of the battle, supports the conventional explanation. Experienced men, recently trained with newly field radar technology, firing on weather balloons, and then on the visual chaos generated by their own barrage. Not a cover-up, not extraterrestrial. Frightened young soldiers doing what frightened young soldiers do. But the UFO community has not simply accepted this verdict, and it would be unfair to pretend that the question its members raise are all trivial. The most sophisticated UFO-oriented analysis of the Battle of Los Angeles focuses on the witness testimony that does not fit the balloon and nerves explanation, particularly the consistent reports from multiple independent observers using binoculars of a large, slow-moving orange-colored object traversing the city from Santa Monica to Long Beach over approximately 30 minutes. This testimony describes something with consistent visual characteristic, moving in a consistent direction for a sustained period, which is harder to dismiss as the random accumulation of perceptual errors than the scattered contradictory reports of swarms at varying altitude. One of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence in the UFO interpretation is the apparent immunity of the object to 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft fire. UFO researchers note that even a weather balloon, fragile and light, would have been destroyed long before 1,000 rounds were expended on it. The counter-argument from skeptics is that anti-aircraft guns in 1942 especially when operating without accurate fire control data in a chaotic, smoke-filled environment, were remarkably inaccurate. Anti-aircraft fire in the Second World War consumed enormous quantities of ammunition relative to the number of aircraft downed. Estimates vary, but it is not unusual to see figures suggesting that thousands of rounds were fired per aircraft destroyed, even under good conditions. In poor conditions, with nervous and inexperienced gunners firing at indistinct targets in a smoke-filled sky, the probability of hitting a specific object was extremely low. The balloon might simply have drifted out of range before being hit. It is also worth considering the sociology of the UFO theory's development, not to dismiss it, but to understand where it comes from. The experience of the late 1940s and 1950s in America produced a specific cultural anxiety about what government knew and were not telling their citizens. The Roswell incident, the development of the atomic bomb, conducted in total secrecy from the public for years, the subsequent arms race, the early revelations about Cold War intelligence program, all of this created a generalized suspicion that official explanations were systematically incomplete. In that climate, the Battle of Los Angeles, with its contradictory official accounts, its single dramatic photograph, and its total lack of physical evidence either confirming or denying the presence of aircraft, was an ideal canvas for speculation. It was undeniably real, officially unresolved, and visually dramatic. Those are the three ingredients that the UFO interpretive tradition finds most compelling. This is not to say the UFO interpretation is merely a product of cultural anxiety and should be dismissed on those grounds. Cultural anxiety can point towards real things. The experience of official deception in other areas is not relevant to how we evaluate official accounts in this one. The appropriate response to the UFO hypothesis is not condescension, but careful examination of the evidence, which examination consistently produced the same result. The evidence is consistent with conventional explanations, does not require unconventional ones, but does not definitively rule out something unusual at the edge. The response of a skeptical investigator to the binocular witness testimony is threefold. First, that witness memory for unusual, stressful events is notoriously unreliable. Second, that the consistent orange color and slow movement are consistent with a weather balloon illuminated by searchlights and drifting on the prevailing wind. And third, that the fact of extensive reporting does not, by itself, establish the accuracy of any specific detail of these reports. All of these responses are valid, but none of them constitute a full and satisfying explanation. What we are left with, in the end, is an event that is historically documented in extraordinary detail. We have military records, newspaper accounts, witness testimonies, photographic evidence, subsequent governmental investigations, and the post-war testimony of the Japanese government, and that nonetheless resists full resolution. The triggering event is most plausibly a weather balloon or balloons. The subsequent reports are most plausibly explained by the psychological fear, the visual chaos of the barrage, and the known mechanics of sympathetic firing and perceptual confirmation bias. The famous photograph is a retouched newspaper image, not a reliable record of what was in the sky. Japan sent no aircraft. And yet, something was out there. the radar contact 120 miles west of the city, the red flare balloon over Santa Monica, the objects described by witness with binoculars, whether those were mundane, extraordinary, or something in between, is a question that has not been and may never be definitively answered. Chapter 13. What it means. There is something almost meditative about sitting with the Battle of Los Angeles for a long time, turning it over, examining it with different angles, following each thread of evidence and testimony as far as it will go. It is one of those events that resists the satisfying resolution we want from historical narratives. It does not have a clean ending. It does not yield a single true account that all the evidence supports. What it does yield is a portrait, vivid and specific, of a society under extreme stress in the early months of a catastrophic war, discovering the limits of its own perceptions in its own institutions. The soldiers at the batteries were not cowards or idiots. They were young men who had been told that the threat was real and who had been given tools to respond to it, and who used those tools when the conditions seemed to require it, even when the evidence was ambiguous. The officers who issued conflicting accounts in the aftermath were not lying. They were interpreting the same genuine, confusing situation from different vantage points with different information. The witnesses who reported formations of planes and crashing aircraft were not lying either. They were reporting what their minds, under extreme stress and stimulation, told them they saw. The Battle of Los Angeles is a story about the fallibility of human perception in human institutions under conditions of genuine and reasonable fear. It is a story about what happens when a society prepares so thoroughly for catastrophe that it brings one about. It is a story about how government, faced with embarrassing ambiguity, reach reflexively for the explanation that serves their interests. And it is a story about how mysteries, especially mysteries with good photographs attached, persist and grow in the cultural imagination long after the mundane details have been established. The Japanese Americans who were arrested in the aftermath and then swept up in the internment program remind us that this mystery was not costless. Wartime fears does not float freely in the abstract. It lands on specific people, specific communities, and does specific damage. The 120,000 people interned under Executive Order 9066 are the most tragic element of the story, of which the Battle of Los Angeles is a chapter. And their presence in the story should complicate any nostalgic or purely wonderstruck engagement with the events of that February morning. But the wonder is real too. Something moved over the city of Los Angeles on February night in 1942, and 2 million people looked up and their city's guns roared, and for an hour the sky was on fire, and in the morning nothing was found. That is genuinely strange. The strangeness does not require extraordinary explanation to be worth sitting with. The 1983 Air Force history, in one of its more reflective passages, observed that the lack of any definitive evidence of enemy aircraft, combined with the abundance of evidence for confused and frightened reporting, points toward what is called war nerves as the essential explanation. War nerves. The phrase has a kind of gentle, almost clinical quality that understates what it describes. War nerves is what happens to human beings when the systems that normally keep perception grounded in reality are overwhelmed by fear. When the reasonable, evolutionary adaptive tendency to scan for threats becomes so activated that it generates threats where none exist. When the social system of verification, other people, institutional authority, documented physical evidence are all compromised simultaneously by the same fear that is distorting individual perception. The story of the Battle of Los Angeles is fundamentally a human one, though genuine mystery persists. Chapter 14: The Long Silence and What Remains. The last veterans who manned those guns are gone now. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade's young men, some of them barely out of high school when they were handed a .5 caliber machine gun and told to watch the sky, grew old and died. And the immediate lived experience of that night has receded into archival records and the oral history tapes in the Fort MacArthur Museum's collection. The city itself has changed beyond recognition. The airfields and defense plants, the civil defense infrastructure of blackout curtains and air raid wardens, the whole apparatus of a society preparing for invasion is long gone, replaced by the enormous contemporary sprawl of one of the world's great metropolitan areas. But the event persists. Every February, the museum in San Pedro marks the anniversary, and people gather to think about it. Every few years, a new documentary or podcast or YouTube episode revisits the evidence and reaches more or less the same conclusions it always reaches. Probably balloons, definitely fear, possibly something else we can't quite account for. The retouched photograph continues to circulate in UFO literature, stubbornly refusing to die despite the availability of the unretouched original negative. The witness testimonies continue to be quoted and requoted by people who find in them something that the official explanations don't quite dissolve. More than 1,400 rounds were fired during the Battle of Los Angeles. 5 people died. Shrapnel fell on houses. Guns fired until the sunrise made the searchlights meaningless. And in the morning, there was nothing to show for it. No wreckage, no enemy dead, no craters in the earth. But what was up there? The honest answer to what was up there is that we don't entirely know. The most probable answer is weather balloons and the human imagination under stress. The most compelling unanswered question is what exactly those binocular-equipped witnesses saw moving steadily over the city for 30 minutes, apparently absorbing 1,400 rounds with no effect. And whether the durability of that question after 80 years of inquiry tells us something or simply reflects the nature of events that occur in the dark, in chaos, without adequate documentation. These questions have not yielded a final answer that satisfies everyone, which is itself a kind of answer about the nature of this event, and perhaps about the nature of historical certainty more broadly. What can be said is that the Battle of Los Angeles is one of the most richly human events in American wartime history, a collision of technology, psychology, politics, and fear that produced a night nobody expected and a morning nobody could explain. It will probably never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. It is the kind of event that is too well documented to be dismissed and too poorly evidenced to be definitively explained. It sits at the intersection of military history, the psychology of perception, the politics of fear, and the long human fascination with the idea that the sky contains things we do not understand, and it has been sitting there for more than 80 years, patient and unresolved, waiting for someone to finally figure it out. There is, in fact, a kind of genealogy of American uncertainty that runs from the Battle of Los Angeles through to the present day's conversations about UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, the term the U.S. government has now officially adopted in recognition that the older acronym carries too much cultural baggage. The Department of Defense's 2021 report on UAP sightings, the Senate hearings, the declassified footage of Navy encounters with unidentified objects. All of these contemporary conversations about what is in our airspace echoes, in structural terms, the events of February 25, 1942. Observations by credible, trained observers, objects that perform in ways not easily explained by known technology, official accounts that contradict each other, the public left with genuine uncertainty and no satisfying resolution. The Battle of Los Angeles was perhaps the first large-scale American encounter with this specific experience. The experience of not knowing as a society what is in the sky above us, and of having that not knowing become a source of both anxiety and fascination. Whether or not the objects in 1942 bear any relationship to the objects in contemporary Navy footage, and there is no evidence that says they do, the experience is part of the same long American story about the limits of institutional knowledge, the unreliability of official certainty, and the enduring human need to know what is out there. Until then, we can only do what the people of Los Angeles did on the morning of February 26th in 1942. Stand in the daylight, look up at the clear California sky, and wonder what exactly was up there in the dark.